All right, I'll have us reconvene. As Lee suggested at the start of the day, we're sort of transitioning from, let's say, the politics of civics to the question of civics curricula. But I think that theme kind of floated around some of the earlier discussions with questions about, well, what exactly should civics include? The guiding questions for the panel then are, what should the disciplinary substance of civics include? In particular, how should civics position itself between the humanities and great books versus the social sciences and public policy, or between graduate education and specialized scholarship versus public outreach and direct community engagement? And the point of those questions is that if we look around at civic centers, even the legislatively, ones that were initiated by legislatures, they really represent a range of those approaches, right? And so I think there's some, I don't want to say controversy, but I think it is an opportunity to discuss, if not debate, what these different options are. And so each of our speakers, again, I don't want to pigeonhole them or put them into a role, but to some extent they are selected because they represent some of these different approaches. I will introduce them briefly. Jeremy Bailey is Sanders Chair of Law and Liberty and Director of the Institute for American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. Will soon be at the University of Florida at the Hamilton Center, but I wanted to use his title there because Jeremy, I think, really represents something that Peter Levine's remarks were maybe gently knocking in the morning, which were the idea of civics as constitutionalism, right? That would be one idea, is what we're doing in civics education is mostly constitutionalism, and there was, I think, some interesting possible pushback from that that we could explore later. Joshua Dunn is professor and executive director of the Institute of American Civics at the Howard Baker School of Public Policy and Public Affairs. And so as that implies, the Institute for American Civics is part of a public policy school. Not that that's all that you all do, but it does have that particular valence or emphasis. Brian Garston is professor of political science and humanities at Yale University, as well as the founder and director of the Citizens, Writers, Thinkers program for New Haven Public Schools. So on the one hand, we get the humanities emphasis there, but also the community engagement emphasis with the remarkable program that Brian has had a big hand in creating in New Haven. Melinda Zook is professor of history and director of the Cornerstone Integrated Liberal Arts Program at Purdue University, which I really think is a national leader in terms of creating a liberal arts curriculum and liberal arts program at a public university. It's done some really unique things there. And so that's, representing a bit of these four different approaches. And so again, I don't want to pigeonhole folks, but I do see this as an opportunity for people to debate the kind of different directions in which civics could go. So we'll go in alphabetical order: Jeremy, Josh, Brian, Melinda. Thanks.
Well, thanks again to Jeremy and to Lee for putting this together. I know this is a tremendous amount of work, and to Heather Morris for all the work there as well. So my remarks will be short. They are basically a polemic with the idea that the audience includes founders and perhaps future founders, and maybe a polemic will be more memorable than a detailed study of a curriculum. My subject is constitutional studies as a curriculum. I should first note that the University of Oklahoma claims to be the first research university in the country to offer a major in constitutional studies. That happened in 2010 or so. I think that claim is more or less true, depending on how you count the major political theory and constitutional democracy at the James Madison College of Michigan State University. More important today, the only other major university to be added to this very small list is the University of Missouri, which is perhaps fitting because Justin Dyer attended the University of Oklahoma as an undergraduate. I should note that Notre Dame has a field in constitutional studies for graduate work, more on that later, but it does not have an undergraduate major. To be clear, I cannot claim credit for the creation of constitutional studies at Oklahoma. That credit belongs to my colleague Kyle Harper, an historian of Rome, and to David Boren, former governor and senator from the state of Oklahoma and longtime president at the University of Oklahoma. Both Harper and Boren saw the need and the opportunity. Later, I came to Oklahoma in 2021, and as director of the institutional home of that major, the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage, and that name is important, I'll say why. Part of my job is running that major. This is to say that I have some familiarity with the operational details of constitutional studies as a major, and some critical distance from its founding, a critical distance that is growing. Or to put it differently, I'm not a founder, I'm an inheritor. I'm not a reconstructor, I'm a faithful son. Those are different tasks and different perspectives. My argument today is that constitutional studies offers an ideal, maybe even the best, packaging for an academic program that both addresses the crisis of civic knowledge in the country and addresses the crisis in the humanities and social sciences in terms of hiring and faculty recruitment. Or rather, that would be my argument if it were the case that there was a healthy supply line of faculty who research and teach American constitutionalism. There is no such supply line, and so my argument today is not really an argument, but rather a reflection about what could have been. Now, this is the second point. It's the bad news. Let me take this second point, the bad news, first. Perhaps the best, or rather the most provocative way to make this point is the remark on a comment that a prominent advocate of schools of civic thought regularly makes with respect to a prominent university's decision to create a school of civic thought. As he put it, that university had 0 experts in the American Revolution and early constitutional period on its history and political science faculty. This claim, this reflection, was in fact true, and others had made a similar observation. But from my perspective, what is also true is that it is very likely that the same very university, even with a school of civic thought, will in 5 years still not have an expert on the American Revolution or the forming of the American Constitution. What we have in the one case, the historical case, is a problem of will, the refusal to hire these people, and then in the other problem, today, a problem of supply, the inability to find these people. And why is this the case? The easy answer is there are now basically 0 mainstream graduate programs in history or political science that is producing PhD students with expertise in American constitutionalism. In political science, the trickle that once existed is quickly has dried up, with key faculty retirements and their corresponding lack of replacements in kind. In fact, political science might be as bad, maybe even worse, than history today, and this tragedy was entirely predictable. But enough with the bad news. Let me make the positive case for constitutional studies. The first is that the Con Studies major is perfectly placed to attract students who end up as political science majors by a process of elimination. I think we all know why students end up in political science or as political science majors, and we all know the limitations of the discipline of political science, at least from the perspective of undergraduate education. Con Studies can offer an alternative, the air of seriousness, to the ambitious student on the way to law school who also might have political ambitions. The second is that Con Studies is the perfect home for programming on freedom of speech and inquiry, programming that is uniquely suited to making friends in the president's office, among otherwise hostile faculty, and with key constituencies off campus. With the 1-2 punch of Constitution Day in September, Free Speech Week in October, the Constitutional Studies unit can create momentum for your unit every fall. The third is that Con Studies can potentially square the circle in terms of reconciling the goals of those who want to bring back Western Civ and those who want to do civics. It can do so by centering the American constitutional tradition and thereby emphasizing the thoughts and actions of the American founders. I don't need to explain this here, but this necessarily requires consideration of the potential contributions of the Enlightenment, Greece and Rome, as well as Christianity. At Oklahoma, the major requires 1 course in 4 areas: antiquity, early modern, the American founding, and contemporary applications. At Oklahoma, it also requires proficiency in 2 languages, 1 ancient and 1 modern. I doubt any of the founders here are ambitious enough to have 2 language requirements. I don't advise it. But it is an example, I think, that demonstrates the point. In other words, I think the most important lesson that I learned at Oklahoma is that the words American, constitutional, and tradition all work together to prevent mission creep and to prevent co-optation from hostile forces. Now, on a related point, and this will be my most polemical claim, it seems to me that a challenge for scholars in schools of civic thought is the apparent misalignment between the private and the public understanding of what it is we're doing, or you're doing. And that is the private and public presentation of their own self-understanding. It seems to me that Con Studies offers a way to fix that misalignment. Now, I suppose that a possible reaction to all these points is connected with another. The fact that the American constitutional tradition is resistant to mission creep is related to the fact that the number of people who work in it is astonishingly small. One cynical answer to this hypothetical response is that teaching American constitutional tradition is not rocket science. People who publish in other areas can do it, and they have. But in major universities, where research excellence is part of the bargain, and the prospect of its necessity in the future, will all but surely threaten the larger endeavor by revealing a possible hollow core in this new project for civic education. Thank you.
Well, I also want to extend my thanks to Lee and Jeremy for putting on this event. I have already been given some good ideas to go back to Tennessee with. Susan, your Aristotelian depiction of civic education has been very helpful for me. I'm going to have curricular innovations that I can return to Tennessee with, a term that normally fills me with terror. But I have some ideas for classes related to athletics, and I'm hoping that they will be approved to meet at Neyland Stadium. We're also advised to make efficient use of university resources. That's a house of worship that otherwise sits unoccupied and unused for about 356 days a year. So I'm certain that this will be approved. This has we'll see how far I get with that. Much of what I was going to say has already been addressed or in earlier sessions and just by Jeremy. And so to avoid that Eighth Amendment violation that we've all experienced, known as faculty meetings, where everything has been said but not everyone has said it, I will restrict my remarks to some of the things that we're doing at the University of Tennessee and the Institute of American Civics, because as Jeremy mentioned, we are a little bit different. We are housed in a School of Public Policy and Public Affairs, which gives our mission a little bit of a different character. As well, something that has to be considered is the expectation of the legislature, and so the statute, the language in the statute, which controls much of what you have to do, and then also the expectations of a board. I have a wonderful advisory board, and they have certain expectations of me and for my colleagues in the Institute that shape what we do. So many of these questions are just answered by them, and we have to pursue them regardless. So if you read the legislation creating the Institute of American Civics, I think you see three core missions that emerge from it. One is to improve civic knowledge. A second is to promote civil discourse. And a third is to promote viewpoint diversity or intellectual pluralism on campus and around the state. I also think that we have three audiences that we are supposed to try to make a difference in our mission with, and that would be students at the University of Tennessee and faculty and staff, but also higher education around the state of Tennessee. That's been even included in the legislation, particularly with regard to the University of Tennessee system, and then the general public as well. And so I'll say a little bit about how we try to meet those requirements, those mandates from the legislation, and with those different audiences. So first, at the university, we are deeply embedded in the Baker School of Public Policy and Public Affairs. So every student who is a public affairs major at the Baker School, which became a school a year and a half ago, we just got our first class of students just this past fall, has to take 4 courses from the Institute of American Civics. Four required courses. The first one, right now it's called Engaging Civically. It's being changed to Foundations of American Citizenship. Start with Plato, Apology and Crito, a little bit of Aristotle, move through some Hobbes, Locke, some English history, and then through the Constitution and some core debates about what it means to be a citizen in the United States. The second course is called Constitutional Foundations. This is, in some ways, it serves 2 purposes. Shows you how public policy is shaped by core constitutional questions, but then it also functions as a little bit of an introduction to constitutional law. Then there's a course on institutions of the policymaking process, or American policymaking institutions. And this would be a kind of much more aggressive or robust approach to the study of American politics that you might get in, say, Political Science 101 or Intro to Government 101 class. And then a fourth class is called The Art of the Possible. And that class is really to show students how to take an idea related to public policy and then bring it all the way through implementation, to show students about the practical nature of politics, the difficult choices that have to be made, so that they aren't just kind of thrown into the world without some understanding of the nature of how you can actually accomplish things. So a lot of case studies in that class. I would say one other thing that we try to focus on in the Institute is on state and local government. I do think that many of the issues that we confront as a country are related to national politics. The polarization seems to be more a function of national politics than state and local politics. And the polarization that we see in state and local politics tends to be when national politics intrudes. So we, for instance, have a local government fellows program where we have students who, for a semester, they go and attend city council meetings. And then they meet with a faculty member who has deep knowledge of how city government in Knoxville works. And we actually had a very good example of the difference between national politics and local politics after October 7th. A member of city council decided that the world was awaiting Knoxville's foreign policy and put a proposal before city council for a ceasefire. And it was fairly slanted. And all of the protesters you can imagine showed up. I had no idea there were this many protesters in all of Knoxville. But they showed up, and it just completely corrupted the nature of what the city government was supposed to do. They couldn't even address the issues that were of core importance to Knoxville during these meetings because of the protesters. And the students got to see what city government normally would do, and then what happened when these kinds of highly polarized national and international issues kind of crept into local politics. So we are in the process also of creating our own major in the Institute of American Civics. I would say it's going to be something like constitutional studies. We're still working on that, but that should be moving forward this year. One advantage I would say of being embedded in the Baker School is that some of the pressure to immediately create a major we didn't quite have, because we knew that we were going to have students fairly quickly moving into our courses. So it gave us a little bit of time to see what we were going to be best at. And this is another area where I think some of what the institutes will do will just be shaped by the different areas of interest and expertise for the faculty. And so we are moving in that direction. Now, around the state, we are trying to provide courses that will be available to students around the state, sometimes in an online format, but we're also trying to make some of our curricula available to other faculty who want to teach it. So for instance, this summer we're holding a workshop with faculty from around the state of Tennessee who want to teach civics using primary sources. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had our first undergraduate civics symposium where we invited students from across the state of Tennessee. We had 10 universities and over 100 students. We had former members of Congress Association came, Democrat and Republican, and then we had Nadine Strawson, and then the Attorney General of Tennessee, Jonathan Skrmetti, engaging in very, I think, spirited but civil discussion about areas that they disagree on. So again, trying to model the virtues that we think are necessary in order for a constitutional republic to flourish. Then we also are trying to, and this is one of I think the most difficult task that I have, it's to reach the general public. To do this at scale in a way that actually makes a difference is a challenge. Of course, the market is saturated with things that can distract people. And so we are working on some online programming, but we are also trying to do some in-person events. So one thing that we have done, we've called it Constitutional Conversations, and that's where we just invite people from the community to come to a dinner. They all sit at separate tables, and we try to put them at tables where we know there will be people who will disagree with them, and just force them to engage in discussions with each other about constitutional issues that still matter today, and they're a source of conflict today. So we've had one on the Second Amendment. We had one on the Electoral College. And most recently, we had one on the pardon power. And I would say it is kind of remarkable when the reaction of the people after leaving these events. Sometimes they're very worried about what they might experience, but overall I think most people left feeling encouraged, knowing that they could engage in fruitful discussions with people that they have very strong disagreements with. So those are some of the things that we're doing at the Institute of American Civics at the University of Tennessee. I, for one, am also looking for more ideas, as I've already mentioned. And so I look forward to further discussion with this panel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Garston. Thanks to Lee and Jeremy and Heather. It's great to hear all these ideas and share them. I'm here, I think, because I founded two programs at Yale. One called Citizens, Thinkers, Writers, which brings students from New Haven, Connecticut, our home city, into Yale to work with undergraduates and graduate students and faculty in small groups. And one called, actually, a Civic Thought Initiative. Actually, there are people in this room who helped me, whether they knew it or not, start both of these. The program for high schoolers was started after seeing what Roosevelt and others were doing at Columbia, and the initiative on Civic Thought came after a conversation with Josh Ober after I gave a talk at Stanford. And what we're doing now is we're bringing them together, these two programs, into a larger Civic Thought initiative. Before I launch into the details, I will tell you a bit about those programs, but I do want to start with a confession, which is that I'm sort of allergic to these civics programs. Not just recent ones, but to civics in general. I bristle a little bit. I'm like the teenager that Susan described still. And so, there's one view of civic education, which is summarized by an offhand remark that Aristotle makes in Book 3 of the Politics about Gorgias, who described making citizens, he was retelling a joke, I guess, of making citizens as like making pots, as though you could just create them, you could fabricate them if you had the right procedure, the right materials. And that view of civic education, I bristle at, I'm suspicious of. But still, we're all aware of this intense trust issue at the moment, this question of a society and whether it trusts universities and colleges. And that's something we need to pay attention to, and that has to do not just with the immediate moment, I think, not just with the worry about ideology or wokeness or other similar worries. I think there's a very much deeper issue that sparks that crisis of trust that universities and colleges will always face. And that's that they are accused still of corrupting the youth. That is, colleges and universities take children away from their parents. Residential ones most obviously, but all colleges and universities. Part of what we do, and it's true, is we take children away from their homes and home communities and parishes, and we ask them to think critically about the beliefs they've inherited. And that is dangerous work. And it's true that students often find themselves, after a period of critical thinking, to use our boring but constant phrase, after a period of critical thinking, students find themselves less attached to the morals and beliefs and guiding instincts they have from home, but unsure of what to replace those instincts with. And they're adrift, and they often describe going home during their first break or their first summer vacation and feeling ill at ease back at home amongst their family. But they're not sure how to translate what has been filling their minds at school back to their family life, but it's not that they feel completely at home at school either. School is a confusing mess of diverse opinions and opinions in formation. All that's to say that the critical thinking that colleges and universities encourage is destabilizing and dangerous, and parents and the rest of society knows it and feels it. And so there's the question of how we can make that critical thinking responsible. How to make thought responsible. And that's a slightly different way, I think, of thinking about civic education than thinking about a particular set of information to convey, although we do convey information in our programs. I'll come to that. But this question of how to make civic thinking, or how to make thinking civic in the sense of responsible to a civic community, I'm tempted to say that the answer must be not information, but giving students a certain kind of experience of thinking with others, ideally, yes, in small face-to-face settings, the experience, yes, of disagreeing and surviving the disagreement. In fact, often even finding that they're closer in some way to the people they've disagreed with. So there's a kind of civic friendship that can come out of that experience, even if we can't presuppose it before that experience. Now, citizenship requires more than the experience of thinking together and talking together with others. Citizenship, requires courage and spiritedness and self-sacrifice sometimes. But as far as what colleges and universities can do with regard to citizenship, I think the thoughtfulness has to be key to our mission. I mean, universities live in particular towns and cities and states and countries, so they're of those political societies, yes, but they're special parts of those societies. We have the space and the time to be our most thoughtful selves. I mean, we have spaces like this. The architecture, the layout of campuses, the buildings, they're all designed to just create some space and some time for thinking together. So we should lean into that as our comparative advantage as institutions, I think. So now, okay, the question is what to do in that space. And we're meant to have some kind of debate between great books and civil discourse and constitutionalism. The truth is, in our programs, we try to do some of each, and therefore we don't do anything as well as we could. But there is a case I want to make for combining these approaches in a certain way to create a kind of experience for the students. And here I do want to say context matters. So I'm going to describe what we do. It came about slowly over 5 to 10 years as we experimented, and I really think these things are context dependent, and it's very important that we don't think there's a model that can simply be exported to different campuses. But I'll just describe some of what we do, as others have, in case it's interesting. For the New Haven high schoolers, we start with an intense 2 weeks on campus during the summer, where it's a residential program. It's aimed especially at students who would be first-generation college students, but not only at them. And they come for 2 weeks, and every day is organized as a kind of progression. We start in the morning with a college-like seminar on a book. So we might read, well, here's one day. We start with Plato's Crito. So Socrates is in jail, having been condemned to death. It's dawn. His friend comes by and says, let's go. I've bribed the guard. Come with me. You've been put in here unjustly. And they have a conversation, and Socrates explains why he won't leave. That's the morning. Then there are 2 seminars. In the next seminar, they read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. Someone else writing from jail. The letter, Martin Luther King mentions Socrates 3 times in that letter. So now when they read those references, they know what he's talking about. Leads to a discussion of just and unjust laws, of civil disobedience, and so on. In the afternoon, we go out into the city or invite people from New Haven in to talk with us who are involved in the civic life of the city somehow. So on that day, we often talk with someone who's been chief of police in New Haven. And he tells them a story about basically a punishment that he could have justly given, but chose not to. And we have pretty frank discussions. The students can ask questions anonymously about policing and matters of justice. So what we find is that starting with the books is a form of indirection of the kind that Susan mentioned. That is, they're freed up when they're talking about a book about ancient Greece to talk about very difficult topics in a way that doesn't seem immediately threatening or immediately political in exactly the way it would be if we dove into talking about the police issues right away in the morning. And so they build this conversation about a text that they have in common. We can all refer to it, they can give evidence and so on. And you build those habits of conversation, and then you move to something more closer to the present day, feels a little more relevant, and then bring it to the world of practice and try to continue those habits of conversation. There are a few advantages of this. First, we have to save reading and books. Reading complicated long sentences and texts is an important skill for citizenship, and it's at risk. There's a complexity that comes with deciphering that kind of text, which our students are still capable of, but they're not asked for as often as it seems they were. There's a certain rhythm of thought that comes with that. And there's a lot to be said for having shared touchstones, shared references, shared stories that you can talk about and analogize to and disanalogize to. At other times, I should say, we work from the practical to the theoretical. So we begin the whole 2 weeks with not a great classic work, but with a chapter from a book called Happy City, which is kind of an urban planning book. But it begins with the story of a mayor in Bogota who really tried to make his city happier. And then it, helpfully for us, asks the question, but what is happiness anyway? And gives a quick gloss of some utilitarians, and then raises Aristotle, and then we use that as a bridge to turn to Aristotle himself and see what he said. So working both ways, to and from the practical world, as Aristotle himself did, seems to work for us. And we also, in the afternoons, find that the people we bring in often raise topics that we can then follow up with theoretical discussions. I would say if you're interested in constitutionalism, talking to refugees from elsewhere in the world is an incredibly interesting, sparked conversation. Recently, I've heard an older woman who could talk about living in Franco's Spain, make the most moving case I've ever heard for why electoral democracy shouldn't be underestimated, that we get to choose yes, indirectly, yes, it's unclear how much each voice matters, but still, we get some say in the general direction of the country. And she made the case for that. We have this other woman comes, a refugee from Afghanistan, who talks about the schools and the challenges that women face in going to school. And she's often asked very critical questions about the US by our students who want her to jump onto those criticisms. And she very gently often says, I know there are many questions here and they deserve to be asked. But at the moment, I just want to draw the contrast between where I was and where I am and make you aware of how important education is. And she goes on. So it's just getting an outsider's perspective can often be a different sort of launching pad into those conversations. Just a couple of other, I don't want to talk too long, a couple of other things that we're experimenting with that seem interesting and distinct maybe. One is, it's one thing for college students to feel that they should be learning something. It's quite another for them to feel responsible for that material in a way that they feel like they are going to pass it on. And so we, more and more, are working with our undergraduates to be mentors to the high schoolers and to one another, and creating kind of tiered communities, because the transformation is incredible when you see a student, sometimes one who you're not sure when you look at his eyes during seminar if he's really with you or paying attention. As soon as you ask that student to then teach or mentor younger students into something similar, now they take ownership of the material, they have to think about how to present it, it becomes theirs, it's inside them now, they're passing it on. It's a completely different stance rather than them being just receptacles. So I think, and in terms of the civic, again, their experience of encountering this material, I think it transforms their experience. So looking for ways to turn around almost as quickly as you can the experience of receiving into the experience of passing on or reproducing in some way is important. And our program, which I'm optimistic is about to be enlarged actually and invested in by Yale, is actually arranged now as 3 nested communities in a way. We have the Civic Thought Initiative, which arranges a whole ecosystem of small-scale conversations on campus, invites guest speakers, and so on, but 99% of it is small seminar-sized scale, small-scale discussions. So that's our work on campus. Then we have the Citizens, Thinkers, Writers work, which is between campus and its home community, making the case that civics is fundamentally about the Kiwitas, the city, the community. And that much of politics is best seen at first in a face-to-face local way. So the campus, the community, and then we are developing a link with some people in Washington because we are part of a national community too, and it's important to think about that interaction. So we don't mean to neglect that, but we are trying to start on the ground close to home and build out. And we are trying to start with the books and both work to and from practical life. So that's how I've gotten over my allergy to civics.
I think I can just stand up. Yeah, okay, so I'll break tradition. This tradition. Okay, the guy tradition. Okay. So it's Zook. I'm Melinda Zook, rhymes with book. And I'm really happy to be here, but I'm never sure why I'm invited to these civic forums. I've been to several. I don't teach civics, and I'm not a historian of the American tradition. I do early modern British history. But I suspect, of course, it's because I built and direct a very large core text program known as Cornerstone. And in fact, it was mentioned earlier by the Dean of Maryland. So I'll speak to that a little bit and then maybe throw out, very briefly, some suggestions about where civics should live and how should we train the people that teach in it. So Cornerstone is a required, has a required gateway sequence for all incoming students at Purdue University, and Purdue University is very large, about 40,000. We taught this year alone 10,000 in this opening sequence called Transformative Text. Transformative Text 1, Transformative Text 2. These are small sections that teach communication and critical thinking skills, but they do it from core text, and I only use full-time faculty. So I'm using tenure track faculty or full-time clinical faculty. I never use graduate students. I don't use any adjuncts. And there's reasons for that we can talk about, but I bet you know what they are. So I choose faculty from every department in the College of Liberal Arts, and there are 10 departments, so that means I've got people from music and theater and all the usual suspects, history and languages, literature, philosophy, et cetera, and so forth. The faculty choose their readings from an expansive list of core texts, which we call transformative texts. I never use the word great books. I'm old enough to remember the wars of the 80s and the 90s over the canon. So we call them transformative texts, and these are books from around the world, not just in the European and American tradition. But they are the world's greatest hits. And in effect, what we're trying to do, and this goes back to our very first panel, is we're trying to give all of these Purdue students, the vast majority are in engineering and technology and science and business, a very small liberal arts college experience their first year in a very large public university. Every session, and I teach this course too, we expect to be an experience in democracy, with the students sharing and listening to one another and talking about ideas. It is more about soulcraft than statecraft. I admit that, and I'm hoping that the things that they take away are inspiration and curiosity and creativity. We are more likely to teach Hamlet than we are to teach Marx, although Marx is taught quite often. We teach a lot of de Tocqueville, he's already come up, Locke, Hayek, Thoreau, and the third most often used author is Frederick Douglass. The first two are Homer and Huxley. They love utopian stuff. So building this program and hiring over 30 faculty of my own that are full-time in the program, and then being involved in every other search in the College of Liberal Arts, because everyone we hire in the College of Liberal Arts has a 50% obligation to teach in Cornerstone, means that I've been involved in over, well, we hired 100 faculty in the last 3 years. And that's because we were able to expand the College of Liberal Arts, because all these students were feeding into Cornerstone and then feeding into our upper level courses. And it's the way that we saved a dying College of Liberal Arts. So I know a lot about newly minted PhDs, and I'll speak to that in just a minute. We do have an offshoot program that is a little closer to civics. The business school wanted its own cornerstone, so we did Cornerstone for Business. This has a curated list with the usual suspects. You know, it's like Plato to Adam Smith in the first section, and then it's Marx through Keynes and Weber on up to Friedman and so forth. So that has a set list. It's also been successful, and one of the things that I've learned from that is your best faculty that you can get to teach these kind of primary texts and sources usually come from philosophy, political science, and classics. They're marvelous. Particularly philosophers and classicists are really well trained to deal with core texts. So if I were creating a civics program, and I also have some nervousness about it, but I'll leave that to the side. I really would rely on political scientists, historians, and philosophers and classicists. And what I would stress, which has not been mentioned yet, although everything else has, so I had to scratch out half my talk, what I would stress is a thorough knowledge of natural rights philosophy. So one of the earlier panels said, let's get rid of left and right in talking about politics, and I agree completely. It's useless, and it divides us. I don't know if we can get rid of it. I don't know why we borrowed anything from the French. But post-structuralism really worked out for us well too. But anyway, that's what I would stress. And the problem with newly minted PhDs is that you take I'm going to pick on my own discipline, the historian, and they'll be really well versed in context, and that's wonderful. But can they teach core texts? And you'll find out that they know all the historiography about the two treatises, but they've never actually read the two treatises. And so you really do want, I believe in the system, and I believe that they can learn to do it. I think that all of us are trained to be close readers and critical thinkers. But you do have to do a sort of lift with these newly minted PhDs to get them to actually read primary sources. Now, I would emphasize this natural rights tradition, and that means that there's a lot of the usual suspects on the list that I was thinking of for what you would want to teach. And I'm much better versed in early modern history. So I'll leave modern history to you guys, because that's where the Americans kind of take over. But for the first part, I would really stress Aristotle, Plato, Hobbes, Locke, Smith, Hume, Burke, Wollstonecraft, who hasn't been mentioned once yet, and then on up to Paine, and then go forth, you modernists. All the way up to MLK and beyond. That's what I would do. That Anglophone tradition of natural rights is fundamental, and it's the tradition we're squandering, right? We're squandering when we don't teach it. And it's calm, it's rational, it's reflective, and engendering a pride of place and self-interested loyalty. It doesn't rely on fable or myth or a draconian police state. Its beauty is its universality, and that's also something we need to get back to. So it's this idea that become an American, right, and all of this will be yours. Now I'm going to quote Alan Bloom, and you're going to fall off your seat, right? It's a little romantic on his part, right? But there's something to it. He writes in this tradition, right? Class, race, religion, national origin, and culture all become dim when bathed in the light of natural right, right? Making us brothers and sisters. I had to add the sisters part. Okay. And you know, and these are my last comments, you know that we brothers and sisters have really been at each other's throats over the last decade. And this has not been healthy, particularly for our students. And now we find ourselves the target of the government's wrath. And it really isn't all that shocking that this should happen, right? you'd have to have been blind not to see the ways in which civic education, ways in which constitutionalism, including British constitutionalism, has been ignored or maligned or undermined. What's the old cliche about getting the government you deserve? So the last thing I think I would, well, two more small points. We live in this country, but we need to train global citizens. And that's why transformative text, I think, is so important from around the world to give them a variety of perspectives. So you want to educate global citizens using core texts. And I always want my students to be able to walk in another human's shoes and to understand the lives of people in former times, but also in other parts of the world. And I want them to understand that we humans have often made a muddle of things, but we're also pretty damn amazing. I would want balance. And I think that's what we're all saying, moderation, balance in the way that we teach. Not to deny the horrors of the past. No one's saying that, right? Not to deny the horrors of the past, but neither should we deny the power and the beauty of the ideas and the ideals articulated by men and women over the ages. And here's my last point, because you're going to fall asleep. I want to tell you something else. I know a lot about Gen Z, our students, because I always teach these freshman classes. And I'm going to tell you, it's not healthy for us to dump on them constantly, to dump every problem that we never solved on them as though they're supposed to solve it, right? If you know anything about our students, to undermine their patriotism, their leaders, their faith, their families, to tell the world them that the world is a ghastly place and it's going to end is not really healthy or helpful. Their anxiety levels are already through the roof, right? So think of it this way. Someday, and this is a quote from The Godfather, and that day may never come, but someday, and that day may never come, we may need these same young people to defend this nation with their lives. And they might ask, why should we?
There's plenty of time for remarks, reflections.
Stunned into silence.
What?
Just wondering if you all had tried to incorporate the extent to which you incorporated literature into the curricula.
What was the question?
The extent to which you've incorporated
Oh, a
fiction
lot.
or literature.
Because I'll tell you why. If you're using a lot of faculty from theater, languages, and literature, they're much more comfortable teaching imaginative literature to students than they would be teaching Marx, right, or Weber. And they're really good at it. And to be honest, the students are much more receptive to fiction. So when we put together the list for Cornerstone for Business, I had a huge fight with the people over I wanted them to use at least one work of fiction, please, in each half. And I finally won. And it's strange, but it's Kafka's The Metamorphosis for the second half. And it's Thomas More's Utopia, which works beautifully, by the way, for the first half. Students respond to fiction, poetry, drama in particular, very, very well. And so, in fact, we just moved The Fable of the Bees into the first half, too, because that works really well. Thank you.
I just want to say we found the same thing in our summer program, even for the high schoolers. Antigone is routinely voted the favorite work, and they spontaneously, over a number of years, just read it together aloud, the night before we were going to discuss it, and short stories and poetry. I think because of what they do in high school, they're more comfortable with that than a philosophical text, certainly. So we find they're good starting points.
One of my colleagues just started including Things Fall Apart in one of her classes. I'm not exactly certain how she's incorporating in it, but as she told me, and I heard it had a good response from the students.
Hi, thank you all for your comments. I'm curious about the labeling. You know, we've been talking about constitutional studies, civics. Josh, it seems like you kind of think of those two as essentially the same. But a lot of these civic schools and centers include the term leadership as well, and that seems to be more on the practical side. And Jeremy, for you, I'm just curious, you know, do you think that practical element, the leadership side, is important? And Josh, perhaps you can comment on that as well.
So the context for my remarks are I inherited a program that was built by somebody else. That program was actually part of an academic department, the Classics and Letters department. And so it's a weird kind of blended existence in which you had endowed professorships, tenure track lines inside, say, my unit, but which had to be hired through the larger department. And so what I found in those conversations is that those three words, American, constitutional, and tradition, provided a way for me to protect the unit against people from outside that unit who had other ideas in ways that, say, just for example, civil discourse would not, or leadership. And so in that sense, it was very effective, and also in terms of explaining to the president's office precisely what we do on campus. Well, doesn't the political science department do that? Well, actually, no, it doesn't, and here's why. And so those are the very effective things. And in my particular context, my sense is that context is probably true at a lot of places. The other bit is that it was actually part of a letters degree, which has existed for like 100 years. And the letters degree is a basket of history, philosophy, and literature courses. And so we have in-house letters faculty who do Shakespeare and Jane Austen, et cetera. And they are, of course, part of sort of the Con Studies letters track. Anyway, so my emphasis on those words is just my observations, how I found it useful in a system I didn't create, but I was able to use it, I think, for the good in that particular bureaucratic context. And I suspect it's replicable elsewhere.
So we just did a focus group with students where we test drove some ideas for the major, but also titles for it. And regarding leadership, I think an accurate summary of the students' response to that was that some of the titles included leadership, and is they perceive it as tired and trite. It's overused now. So you can take that for whatever it's worth, but they seem to think there's leadership programs everywhere. No one's exactly certain what it is.
I'll be saying more about this in the next session, but I'm the dean of a leadership studies school. So, hey, maybe it's tired and trite, but it has been the enrollment there's been growing over the last 10 years, and certainly over my tenure. But we talk about teaching for and about leadership at the school. So it's both something that can be studied and something for which some training can be offered. So there's the about, which is the academic piece, but then there's the civic engagement and so on, which is the sort of preparation piece.
Hi, Scott Carroll at UT Austin. I'm also in a school of civic leadership, so we'll get to pick on Josh a little bit in the next session. But I'm the resident economist here today, and I only hear okay, great. We packed this all together in the last session, but heard a little bit, you know, in terms of the curriculum, a little bit of Adam Smith, a little bit of Marx, but wanted to see what the overall thought on the role of economists in both the schools as well as the curriculum, and what's the right balance there.
Me? Okay, well, actually I had economists on my list, and I think it got scratched off when I was dealing with other problems I had to scratch off. But I actually think that economists should be involved in these kinds of endeavors, whether it's civics or a sort of Cortex program. Economics is not in the College of Liberal Arts, so there's a disciplinary thing. And even though I'm working with the business school, I don't have them teach in my program because that would defeat the purpose. The program is for us to teach. and to bring their students hopefully into more of our courses. But I work with economists. I think they're great. I think they should be teaching in these programs. I think they should also be in the liberal arts. But and also, by the way, I mean, I've said this before. I think that if you're going to do civics, you should also do economics. You should have it incorporated, right? Because they do go hand in hand. You should teach them what is free market, whatever, right? They should know these things.
So in the major we're developing, they're going to be required courses in economics, and we're also envisioning a course on political economy as being a required course. So we think it's essential for the students to have some exposure to it, to be an effective citizen. So.
A little bit related question, I think. Different take on it is, Josh gave us a talk in which bargaining was a central thing, and I can imagine a curriculum built on that in which you learned. I mean, you said you taught game theory as I do as well, but and negotiation strategies and those kinds of things would be central. A lot of the panels, I don't want to overgeneralize, but all day, apart from Josh, have been about dialogue and deliberation as pursuit of truth or as pursuit of mutual understanding, or pursuit of what's right. And so that's classically those are different. And so I'm wondering about the space. So it's partly that bargaining sounds more like a skill, but also it does have a theory, and that theory hasn't been mentioned by anybody except Josh, although it sort of came up a little bit when you were alluding to economics, because some of this is in fact economics. So what do we think about bargaining versus dialogue or deliberation, basically, in the curriculum?
I will say something. You know, I thought about this, especially about the deliberation side. I don't even think we teach that, to be honest, at least in our programs. To teach deliberation, you'd have to present a problem that has a number of possible outcomes and have people actually, I mean, the deliberation is not conversation. Deliberation has an end, I mean, obviously, and, so you have to make a choice together. And that is important for citizenship. We've been experimenting a little bit with self-governance by the students, but just a tiny bit. It's inspired by Deep Springs and models of education like that. So that would be closer to an experience of deliberation, and then you could reflect on the experience and so on. And maybe alongside that, you could have a bargaining component. There's a lot of work to be done to even bring students to a position where they can confidently engage in that sort of activity, I think. So, you know, part of me is Tocquevillian. I think practice is an experience in bargaining and deliberating with some thinking about that experience is the best training. But I also think there's a lot of other work to be done, and that rushing too quickly or too directly to that ignores the kind of, you called it soulcraft function that we're also aimed at.
The class that I mentioned, The Art of the Possible, I think that's a core component of that. A lot of analysis about what people had to do to make something happen and the trades they had to agree to. So.
This is a general question about the relationship of the specific civics curricula with regard to some other one familiar, one unfamiliar body. So I'd be grateful if folks could say a little bit about how they conceive of their preferred curriculum as it relates to general education, where of course one finds in mid-century very familiar kinds of aims articulated by various institutions. And you know, that's obviously a large topic. Here's a sort of question about the process of articulating these curricula. I think one of our colleagues remarked this morning about the American Liberal Arts Colleges perhaps being the most distinctive American contribution to education. When you go back to the 19th century, what one finds are these president's courses that are the summative moment in the education for undergraduates. I just wonder if anybody had made an effort to look at those curricula and some of the texts there, which are quite surprisingly used, but I think quite interesting.
I ran a humanities program that included a great books program that was modeled on some of those general education courses, although it was not required of everyone. And I also helped design a common curriculum, so a required core for a new college in Singapore years ago. And you know, the negotiations, to speak of bargaining, between the faculty on the content of those courses were intense, difficult, but also intellectually really rewarding. I came away thinking that the general solution at most universities, which is not to have a shared curriculum, but instead to have a series of checkboxes that students have to check, is an abdication of our responsibility as a faculty. And it's difficult to teach citizenship, but without modeling it. And I don't think our universities are always great citizens themselves in their communities, and I don't think we function as a place of citizenship for the most part. We tend to, we're divided into disciplines, and so it's a real challenge that most universities are not meeting, and I, for one, wouldn't underestimate the difficulties of doing that, but can't think of a more worthwhile project. But it requires people who regard that as part of their joint enterprise that is coming up with a shared curriculum, and that, for the most part, is not the faculty that we have.
Just one quick record. I've actually been a successor twice now. One was at the University of Houston's Honors College, the Phronesis Great Books minor, which had 100 minors. Sue Collins founded it. And what I've noticed in both of these programs is that these are basically, they're two models of a curriculum. One is a cartel among friendly faculty who agree, and they put aside whatever curricular ideas they have in order to make what they can agree to work. And then those people disappear, and the cartel no longer works. And so you're left holding a bag with a program that no administrative unit's going to be interested in supporting, continuing on the whatever intellectual merits that used to exist, right? So the second problem, the other alternative is some sort of like platonic ideal of the perfect curriculum, but that's impossible without some sort of muscle that's going to protect you and enforce it, right? And so this is the dilemma that you are, at least in the successor stage.
This down the table in a second. I just wanted to raise one sort of question that maybe the two deans could bring up later on about economics, because one thing that's not clear to me, and it links a bit in with Jeremy's earlier statements about what political scientists do and don't do anymore. It seems like everyone agrees we should do more economics. And the question that I have, and I really don't know the answer, but some of you would know better, is how much of what we need to do from economics is something that economists are no longer doing? And that's something I'd like to know. So, you want to? Sure, yeah. No, we can bracket it, but I just wanted to bring that up. So, yeah.
So, thank you. I'm Cherie Strawn, and I direct the Bliss Institute of Applied Politics, and I just mentioned that because I think about some of this. I appreciate all of this. We do cover constitutional law in our political science department with 2 classes. We have our theorist who taught American political thought just retired, but we're seriously interested in replacing, and we've woven, those kinds of courses into a new degree in applied politics and civic leadership. But I think about this, I got the job, I think, because I do applied work around, and have for some time, around citizenship and civic engagement. I'm part of a movement within political science over the past couple of decades that has pushed for not simply teaching substantive knowledge, but for teaching the skills and like our learning objectives need to be beyond disciplinary knowledge and civic knowledge, and we need to encompass also the skills and identities, which we talked a lot about this morning, that are required for good citizenship, right? For all the things we talked about this morning. And I've heard a lot of that I really appreciate and agree with about the kinds of knowledge that we need to teach and the kinds of conversations around knowledge that we need to teach. It's a lot of work, right? To read the books, to engage critically, and to do this work. And I've come to the conclusion that I think we need to start with identity first, because how do you get people to care about these things and think they're relevant to themselves unless they're going to use them, right? Like reading this, analyzing it, thinking about it critically is a lot of work for students who, a lot of times when they take an intro to American government class or a required class in American political thought, are doing a memory dump, right? Because they don't think it's relevant. And I tend, from a Deweyan perspective, to think that what cultivates identity is performative. So when I talk about, and it's hard to persuade political scientists to do this, but I've been trying for a long time. And so when I give them a really simple, they go, it's impossible, we can't do character development, it's so hard. And so we do it every day, we just have to think about doing experiential learning and applied, like how do you know who you are is that people put you in experiences and expect you to perform. And I give him an example from my son's childhood where he wanted drum lessons. My husband bought him, I don't know, I think it was an $800 drum kit while I was away. I was like, what? And so I said to my son, you're not going to take drum lessons. We made a major investment. You're going to be a drummer. And how did I turn him into a drummer is I put him in a school of rock band. And the other little kids that were in his school of rock band, if he did not keep time and perform and do all the things, it's performative, right? He became a drummer because it was expected of him, not by me, but by his peers. So how do we embed in our curriculum, putting people like, I don't expect you to be a good citizen because you read this book and, 5 years from now you're going to be a good citizen. I expect you to start performing the way we expect good citizens to perform right now. That's one thing coming from the gray-haired lady at the front of the room. It's another thing if I put them in experiences where we can get the peer expectations to reinforce that. So I've been doing a lot of work. Just the thing that I've been doing is applied deliberative work, right? Like if your peers expect you through a graded process to be the kind of person that produces, right, through consensus and deliberation and civility and reason giving, expects you to perform that role, then it is supposed to stick, right? But I just wondered if anybody had thought further along those lines of, Tocqueville says, what are the schools of democracy? It's civil society and he didn't mention us, by the way, right? Like really, right? It's civil society and voluntary associations and the performative roles that they play, and have people thought about, we do it on the scale that we can. We're at a regional public, we have tight resources, I have an endowment, but have people thought about bringing that to scale or how to embed that? That would be my question.
Maybe just, further down.
Well, we started something called the Tocqueville Scholars Program, which that's just part of it. As part of that, they have to participate in a reading group, and they are exposed to important texts, but then also controversies and the ideas that they have to engage in meaningful and civil discussion and dialogue with their peers who they disagree with. So it's kind of at the core of what we do with that program.
Still on the theme of things in the direction a little bit of practice, it seems to me one sort of natural type of activity or skill that would be valuable and also intelligible to outsiders as valuable is rhetoric, which there's some strong continuity between the great books, reading things closely and understanding them, but then also on, reasonable forms of political engagement, and persuasion there. And you could imagine incorporating some element of practice that would be valuable to people that stick all the way through such a curriculum, or people that's maybe the only touch they have on it, but prepares people. And again, I think it's intelligible to a lot of different people as a valuable skill. So again, just any thoughts on incorporating that?
Well, in the major that we're developing, one of the classes that we are proposing is called Civic Reasoning and Rhetoric. And the idea is to really start with maybe just basic logic and some natural fallacies, things, and then move on to speeches, debates, and force students to evaluate them.
One thing about, of course, the long tradition of practicing rhetoric is you have to get inside your audience's head if you want to hope to persuade them. And so if you're addressing people who don't agree with you or who might not, you have to figure out the structure of their beliefs. So if you're interested in pluralism of this kind, I think the rhetorical skills can be incredibly helpful. I also wanted to say one thing about the practice angle, because there are different ways to think about the connection to practice. One is, of course, to create citizens, to give them practice, doing citizen-like activity. In 2019, when I, in my own little context, happened on this phrase, civic thought, I was actually centering the noun thought. So universities are first and foremost places of thought, and the question is, I love uncivic thought, I love free, irresponsible thought, creative, but they are institutions that live in societies, and they also need there's a kind of civic responsibility for thinking, and that's a little bit of a different project. That is, it's less about shaping the students into the model citizen, and it's more about asking what it means to think and present our thought responsibly. I think that's a dimension of civic thought that's often lost. And that can come from thinking about practice, but that's different from training or giving practice.
Maybe continuing the string, as it were. But when I've been talking with people about civics programs, how they think about education of citizens generally, it seems that there are these sort of four pieces that keep on coming up. And one is sort of the knowledge piece. You know, we really should know something. So, you know, constitutionalism, you really should know something. And the second is sort of some kind of a disposition. You ought to have some kind of a disposition towards your fellow citizens that you can put it in terms of Aristotelian virtues, as I sort of tend to, but at any rate, there's sort of a way that you treat people. And then there's what I think a bit about the kind of skills that you need to have. So, you know, you have to learn to listen. It's not an easy thing to learn necessarily, and at least listen actively and respond in a way that other people can listen to you. And then you have to have some experience. You have to go out and do something, right? So one of the big questions that all seems to me is, how do we order this? And at least one of the thoughts I've had is that you have to know something before you're going to be a good practitioner. You have to develop some kind of dispositions before you're going to develop the right skills. So there is a kind of an order to it, but if we have left out any of these pieces, maybe we haven't really done what we need to do. So are there other thoughts about, how we, is that the right set of things that we should be thinking about? And is there a way in which we ought to have a hierarchy, an order to whatever one imagines is the kind of program you see as the best sort of program?
Well, I mean, the knowledge has to come first. It has to come first before you decide that, okay, now you're going to do some sort of engagement project, because they don't know what they're doing. Right, and anybody can collect names on a petition. They really need to know what they're talking about first. And to the rhetoric question, we should be better models for them. We really should. I asked all the Cornerstone faculty that teach the oral communication component to do speech for them. So they used TED Talks. They did every other thing, but they were worried because they were worried about their own ability. And that worries me, to do a speech. So I think we're their first contact. We need to teach them. We're knowledge workers. We need to teach them what we know in a sensible way. We're also role models for them of what it means to be a scholar, to be someone who loves books and learning. And then maybe think about go forth.
I agree, of course, the knowledge comes first. I think that some of the problems we experience are related to the lack of knowledge as well. Some of the anger and anxiety simply stems from people not knowing how our system is designed to function. And then again, if you want people to be effective and to be intelligent citizens, they simply have to know. We did a survey of Tennesseans to measure civic knowledge and also civic attitudes, willingness to participate. And so one of the things that we want to find out how many Tennesseans know that we have our own Constitution. And I don't know it was 50%, which maybe that's higher than you might have guessed, but it's still not really good. And in 49 states, in order to pass a state constitutional amendment, it has to go through the voters. So presumably, I think you would get similar results around the country. You have people voting on constitutional amendments that aren't necessarily aware that they have a constitution that they're voting. I think that's a bit of an issue.
The holy grail for me at Oklahoma was to get inside of the orientation for first-year students during the intake week to walk through First Amendment training, because I would say 90% of students think that, just for example, hate speech is unprotected. I would say 80% of faculty also think hate speech is unprotected. And just to correct that error, so it's impossible to reason with my neighbor if I think I have authority over my neighbor, for example. But it was very difficult. Student life fought very, very, very hard to resist that. Even with some, at least some support from the president's office, it was still hard to get student life to help facilitate that.
I'm not sure knowledge always comes first, can I just say?
Okay.
I mean, students will learn what they're motivated to learn, and sometimes if there's a problem they want to solve or a story they can see themselves as a part of, suddenly what they're interested in learning, it's the most obvious thing, but and I think the stories that appeal to students are very context dependent. I mean, I'm at an elite college in a post-industrial small city, and we have a certain constellation of outsized ambition and insecurity and certain relations between the town and the school, and we find that if you start from those very tangible, concrete matters and introduce them to stories that are not directly about Yale and New Haven, but are about related matters, the students start envisioning possible stories for themselves, and then they may have all sorts of questions and things they want to learn, and then there's room for knowledge.
Okay. Thank you. So, each of you represent a pretty diverse spread of different kinds of institutions and kinds of programs. I was wondering about if you could speak to the extent to which you find yourself caught up in remedial work with your students, and this is why, I mean, again, you're at different institutions, different kinds of programs, so I'm very interested to hear if you're all experiencing the same thing or different kinds of things. If you do have that experience, which is not unusual, then what seems like the best path for taking students from that remedial stage, whatever that means for your students, to something higher in whatever amount of time that you have with them, whether that's 2 years or maybe all 4 years?
So for us, it depends on the students. So the students who are in the Baker School, the public affairs majors, have been extraordinary. But there's all sorts of self-selection that goes on with that. And you'll notice it when you teach. We have freshman level courses that we've managed to get into the Vol core curriculum that has 1,300 courses. And some students just show up in these classes because it satisfies some kind of core curriculum requirement. And there you can just see a wide range of background knowledge. And it's not that the students necessarily aren't very capable. It's just you might have engineering students, obviously very bright students, but they aren't quite certain what a state is. not like Tennessee, but what in the general sense of it. And so that can be a challenge, particularly when we have some students who are very well prepared for it and are naturally inclined to want to study it, versus those who are fulfilling a requirement.
Our students, the vast majority of them in Cornerstone are engineers. They're good. They're good students, and they're curious, and they love this class because it's not like any other classes. It's not reading and writing, although reading with them to start really helps. We, take Antigone is often the first text to read with them. Writing is not a problem except for the fact that they will cheat if you let them. So a lot of it now is in class or at a computer lab, so we can control it. I asked for dead classrooms with no Wi-Fi, but I wasn't given those, so because they don't have them. But so it's a no tech, all classes for Cornerstone, no technology whatsoever, because otherwise, as soon as a phone is out, they've disappeared. So that's not the hard part. Sometimes the hard part is actually getting them to talk because they're shy, and there's always a few that are just can't shut up, and then that's 5, but it's 30 students. So getting them all to talk, so that's why actually I use plays quite a bit because I dole out parts, and I have them read aloud a lot no matter what it is. To just get them to hear their own sound of their own voice and hear each other. So we do that. We do a lot of games too, by the way, because games work really well. And case studies and case competitions and debates, those things work very well.
First off, thank you to the organizers, but also to every participant. It has been an absolute privilege to be a part of today. So thank you. A little bit, Brian has already spoken to this, but I wanted to speak to Josiah. I really liked the framework that you posed with the what should come first, what is the right order. And I'm going to do something that I've heard several people do today and say that, oh, I'm the outsider in the room as the non-political science. I'm coming from the past decade being outside of higher ed in the museum field. And in that context, thinking about public education, it is very important to invite everyone to the conversation with their lived experience, because when you encounter, let's say it's an impressionist artwork, someone might feel like, oh, well, I can't speak to this because I don't know the context of the artist or XYZ, and it is, I think, very important when we're talking about civics and when we're talking about participation for people to be enfranchised. We want them to participate. But I will jump away from there to ask what I actually wanted to ask you, Brian, is I want to believe that it is just because it is the right thing to do and that you are an incredible convincer that you are able to expand on this high school program, but how did you get the institutional buy-in and support to build on that?
Yeah, that's what you said. No, look, I read about what Roosevelt and others were doing, and it seemed like it would be a great thing for New Haven, and I think I first asked the dean if I could use funds that were supposed to be for yet another colloquium for a pilot instead, and was lucky to have an amazing, actually a student of Susan's, an amazing graduate student who was really skilled at. So we built this kind of experimentally, very small, and the idea was just to get facts on the ground and see if it worked, and then we assumed money would come, and then the Teagle Foundation came in very importantly for us with a bridge grant, and now Yale has taken it over and is expanding it. So I think every university probably works differently. My judgment at the moment was, rather than working from the top down and trying to get buy-in at the top right away, to just get some facts on the ground, and then if it's working well, get recognition for what we were doing.
Oh, sorry. So I've been thinking about this all throughout the panel, and it's been touched on a little bit, mentioning of identity and enfranchisement, and then mentioning of, the adoption of MLK's letter to Birmingham, as well as Frederick Douglass. But how do you deal with the legacy of exclusion in all of these in these civics classes, or even in civics discourse? Because, even if we go all the way back to Aristotle and all those people and talking about, civic society, there were people who were in the room allowed to have these discussions, and there were people who were not there, right? And in particular for Douglass and MLK, right? We're talking about this discrimination and, black men being excluded, eventually black women, and, eventually people of color, et cetera. Right? And so now here we are, 2025, and we're trying to have these conversations and promote why, civic engagement matters, and we want to be, global citizens and, save democracy, all the virtues, right? But there is still the ghost, right, of exclusion that is still in here. And so, how do we deal with that? Even if it's just me thinking about it in the back of my head, but I know that there'll be 1 or 2 students that will call out the ghost. And so, how do we address the ghost?
Address it directly. We in our foundational class, they read Frederick Douglass. They read Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Boer. They read Martin Luther King Jr. They read the Civil Rights Act. Read about the expansion of the franchise based on race and sex. You don't avoid it. You've got to address it.
To what extent was the 3/5 clause a necessary condition for the Electoral College? To what extent was it a sufficient condition for the Electoral College? I would wager that 90% of the people in the zip code can't answer that question. To me, that's what our education needs to be figuring out.
I would just say in our high school program, many of the students we have, it's a small city, they've walked by the buildings, these grand Yale buildings, their whole lives have never been invited in any way. And when they finally are, it's a complicated experience because they're not really invited in, they're invited in for this program. And so that becomes a theme really through the whole program for many of them. And many familiar texts that we assign, even, if you're reading Aristotle, you're reading about slavery. If you're reading Locke, you're reading about property in America and certainly the constitutional moments. So even familiar texts, the conversations are different depending on the students you have in the room, and we certainly find that and try to grapple with it directly, as you're saying. I'd also say, I guess our spirit from the beginning has been the one that Du Bois articulated when he talked about creating a kingdom of culture that everyone can be a part of. And when he said, "I sit with Shakespeare," and he winces, not. In other words, these books are for everyone. And that has been our finding. We were nervous at first, like, would Socrates be of interest to some of these students? It turns out intensely. So once they're reading a story, so we try to read a range of stories from a range of backgrounds, but we do find that actually all of these stories are of interest to all of our students, and some of them have voiced appreciation for the fact that they're not directed just to read stories from a certain background based on their identity.
We're at 3:15, so we'll reconvene in 15 minutes, but thank you to our panelists for a great session.